The steel door didn't just close. It crashed shut behind him with a metallic blast that rattled the entire hallway. In that moment, the man once entrusted with $65 billion, Bernard L. Madoff, walked forward in chains, flanked by agents whose eyes stayed locked on him as if he were radioactive. His wrists gleamed with cold silver cuffs, but what froze everyone in that corridor was not the restraints. It was his expression. No fear, no panic, just a chilling, almost satisfied half-smirk, the kind only a man who had manipulated the world could wear. Because even now, even with his empire in ashes, Bernie Madoff knew something no one else in that room did. One secret. One final twist in the greatest financial deception in American history. And it began with a name buried so deep in his past. The public had never heard it. Not yet. Before we open this classified file, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. I'm building the Scamsphere global map. And if you're obsessed with real-life scam stories that feel like crime thrillers, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case file. Smash that like. Share with someone who loves dark financial mysteries. And get ready, because this story only gets darker from here. Here's the thing about historic disasters. They rarely start with screaming. They start with silence, heavy, suffocating silence. And on the 17th floor of Manhattan's Lipstick Building, inside a spotless office where even the air felt carefully controlled, Bernie Madoff sat perfectly still, not sweating, not nervous, just calmly flipping through a newspaper while billions of stolen dollars dissolved into thin air beneath the surface of his empire. This wasn't just a scam. This was a precision-engineered machine, humming quietly in the shadows for decades. But long before the truth erupted and scorched the financial world, long before Madoff became a global synonym for betrayal, one unexpected spark appeared. A spark that would eventually ignite the detonation. And ironically, it didn't come from a suspicious banker, a furious investor, or even the relentless whistleblower chasing him. No, it came from inside his own family. In early December 2008, Bernie's sons Mark and Andrew Madoff stepped into their father's office expecting nothing more than another day in the empire he'd built. But something felt wrong the moment they saw him. His fingers twitched. His lips pressed into a thin line. His usually steady voice was trembling under the weight of something monstrous. Then he broke. "It's all one big lie," he said. Time froze. There's nothing left. It's all a Ponzi scheme. The words hit the room like a bomb detonating. Mark and Andrew stared at their father as if they were seeing a stranger wearing his face. For years, they had believed they were part of something elite, something immaculate, a firm trusted by celebrities, banks, hedge funds, philanthropies, and billionaires. But in a single moment, their reality collapsed. His empire wasn't real. Their legacy wasn't real. The wealth, the praise, the prestige, all fake. While Bernie expected loyalty, expected silence, expected them to help him conceal the collapse, his sons did the opposite. They contacted their lawyers. Their lawyers contacted the authorities, and within 24 hours, the FBI stormed the Madoff penthouse, dragging Bernie into custody. The quiet implosion had begun. Decades of deception would spill out in the days that followed. Billions vanished, thousands ruined, and a scam so colossal it infected nearly every layer of the financial system. But to understand how Bernie pulled this off, to understand why so many brilliant, wealthy people trusted him blindly, to understand how this monster operated, we have to go back. Bernie Madoff didn't start as a monster. He began as an ambitious kid from Queens who knew he'd never fit into the Ivy League power circles that ruled Wall Street. He lacked the lineage, the pedigree, the blue blood network. But he had something more dangerous: the ability to read people. In 1960, with $5,000 he saved from lifeguarding, he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. And right from the start, he understood something most people never learn. Investors don't chase returns, they chased trust. So he built trust like a fortress. He cultivated a spotless reputation. He made himself seem like the safest hands in the world. Eventually, he rose to become chairman of NASDAQ, a title so powerful it silenced every doubt. And the moment the world trusted him, he weaponized it. Bernie's brilliance wasn't in offering giant returns. Those get spotted. Those draw suspicion. His genius was offering calm, steady, almost comforting profits, the kind that looked safe, conservative, almost boring. The kind that made investors feel smart, not greedy. He wrapped it all in a strategy called the split strike conversion, a term so complex it practically discouraged questions. Most people couldn't understand it, and that was the point. Confidence replaced curiosity. He targeted the wealthy and the connected, Jewish charitable organizations, Palm Beach families, European banks, Hollywood moguls, hedge fund aristocrats, fund managers, and retirees. And once they joined, they became walking billboards, bragging about the steady genius who never missed. Victims poured in by the thousands. Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity $15.2 million. Gone Steven Spielberg's Wonder Kinder Foundation. Millions gone Jeffrey Pickauer withdrew over $7 billion. Norman Brayman, tens of millions destroyed countless individuals like Carla Hershorn, Stanley Chais, and more, each losing millions. He didn't just take their money. He took their confidence, their status, their identity. That was the magic. And the poison. Back on the 17th floor, behind a door so restricted that most employees didn't even know its true purpose, the beating heart of the Ponzi scheme throbbed in the dark. Inside was a time capsule of fraud. IBM AS 400 machines from the 1980s. Matrix printers endlessly spitting out fictitious trade confirmations, stacks of forged statements, and an entire fake trading universe created out of thin air. No investments, no trades, just a factory of lies. The operators of this secret world, Frank DePascali, the loyal right hand. Annette Bongiorno, who processed fraud for decades. Jerome O'Hara and George Perez, programmers engineering false data. And David Kugel, a longtime contributor to the deception. They weren't masterminds. They were caretakers of the illusion. And that illusion was beginning to rot. Enter Harry Markopoulos, a mathematical bloodhound, a forensic accountant who didn't just suspect fraud, he proved it. His calculations exposed the impossible reality behind Madoff's returns. To achieve them, Bernie would have needed more stock options than existed in the entire market. Markopoulos warned the SEC repeatedly. 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007. 2008, he practically begged them to stop the ticking bomb. But the SEC, blinded by Madoff's reputation, failed over and over again. The biggest scam in American history didn't survive because it was sophisticated. It survived because it was comfortable. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. Markets collapsed. Panic skyrocketed. Investors demanded withdrawals in the billions. And for the first time in decades, the Ponzi machine seized up. The flow of new money stopped. The illusion cracked. Bernie was finished. By December 10th, the coffers were dry. The next morning, the FBI would arrive. But before that knock, Bernie told his sons something else. Bernie's whisper hung in the air long after his sons left the room, echoing in their minds like a ticking bomb they couldn't deactivate. They had expected a confession, maybe an apology, maybe panic. But what their father said carried a strange, unnerving calmness. It wasn't the voice of a desperate man about to be exposed. It was the voice of someone who had already accepted the collapse and was warning them that the real nightmare had just begun. As they walked out of the office with shaking hands, calling their lawyers in a frantic haze, they couldn't shake the feeling that Bernie wasn't telling them everything. In fact, what he whispered didn't feel like a confession at all. It felt like a coded message, a final cryptic signal from a man who had controlled the financial lives of thousands for decades. When the FBI knocked the next morning, the tension inside the Madoff penthouse was suffocating. But Bernie wasn't pacing. He wasn't crying. He wasn't pleading. He was sitting in an armchair like a host waiting for guests to arrive. His tie was straight, his posture perfect, and his expression disturbingly neutral. As agents entered the room, Bernie stood with the same calm composure he displayed at charity galas and board meetings. To the agents, it was unsettling criminal, Stan. T usually greet federal arrest with the demeanor of a man about to begin a scheduled business appointment. He listened to the charges politely, nodded, and placed his hands forward as if he'd rehearsed it. What investigators didn't T realize at that moment was that the real chaos would unfold not in the arrest itself, but in the documents, files, and digital wasteland inside the Madoff offices. Bernius whispered to his sons, "They want T find half the things they think they're looking for. And what they do find won't make sense," proved to be more than arrogance. It was a prophecy, and it came true almost immediately. When agents reached the 17th floor, they encountered something they had never seen before. It wasn't a modern trading floor. It wasn't sleek or advanced. It was a chaotic time capsule of rows of outdated IBM AS 400 computers, humming like relics printers from the 1980s, spitting out forged statements, file cabinets stuffed with records, so old and persistent, they looked like props from a conspiracy documentary. The deeper they went, the more nightmarish the structure became. There were files with missing pages, numbers that didn't add up, ledgers written in different handwriting styles, and account statements printed years apart but clearly made on the same machine. The entire operation was a labyrinth of maze, built deliberately to confuse anyone who wasn't T. Bernie Madoff himself. And the names they found inside that maze, they shocked even experienced investigators. Elite foundations, Fortune 500 executives, charitable organizations, Hollywood powerhouses, European banks, multi-generation family offices, thousands of retirees. No one had been spared. The losses were staggering. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity wiped of $15.2 million. Steven Spielberg's Wunderkinder Foundation gutted of millions. The Chi's Family Foundation obliterated. Jeffrey Picard withdrawing over $7 billion. Norman Brayman losing tens of millions. And countless families, people who trusted Bernie as if he were a guardian left with nothing but ashes and broken futures. Yet, when Bernie was questioned about the victims, there was no emotional collapse, no remorseful tears. His responses were mechanical, almost clinical. It was as if he were explaining someone else's system, someone else's choices. He didn't speak like a man who had stolen billions in life savings. He spoke like an engineer describing a machine that had finally stopped working. Meanwhile, forensic investigators tried unraveling the mess. But the deeper they probed, the more reality slipped away from them. Records contradicted other records. Trades that were supposedly executed didn't exist on any exchange in the world. Portfolios showed assets that had never been purchased. Some accounts were opened decades apart but looked identical in structure. Some names were partially redacted. Some were duplicated under aliases. It became clear that Bernie hadn't just committed a crime. He had built a universe of fiction so elaborate that even after confessing, the truth remained buried under decades of handcrafted deceit. And then there was the man who had seen it coming long before anyone else. Harry Markopolos, the lone mathematician who had mathematically dismantled Madoff's alleged trading strategy year after year. To him, the fraud was obvious. The returns were impossible. The math didn't work. But every time he approached the SEC with evidence, warnings, detailed models, and clear proof, he was dismissed, overlooked, ignored, not because he was wrong, but because Bernie's reputation was too strong. Regulators didn't fail because they were blind. They failed because they trusted the wrong man. While all of this unfolded, Bernie's sons lived in a psychological hell. Their father's whisper replayed constantly in their minds. The news cycle turned them into villains overnight. They weren't arrested, but they were publicly crucified. Their homes were stalked by reporters, their phones bombarded, their reputations shredded. They insisted they had no knowledge of the fraud, and investigators found no evidence they were involved, but the public didn't care. The surname Madoff cast a shadow no one could escape. Even as federal investigators pieced together the collapse, one question lingered in every room, whispered by agents, lawyers, analysts, and journalists alike. Why did Bernie confess right then? Why December 10th? Why surrender instead of disappearing or fighting or running? When an FBI agent finally asked him that question directly, Bernie paused, looked up, and answered with chilling simplicity, "Because the world ended yesterday, and I knew the rest would follow." With that, they escorted him away. The empire was dead, but the consequences were only beginning to surface. The fallout from Bernie Madoff's confession was immediate, ruthless, and far-reaching. Thousands of investors awoke to a nightmare, a reality in which decades of hard work, trust, and careful planning had been wiped out overnight. People who had invested life savings, pensions, and charitable endowments were left staring at spreadsheets filled with numbers that existed nowhere but on paper. It wasn't just the money that was stolen, it was their sense of security, their identity, and in many cases, their faith in humanity itself. Some lost hundreds of thousands. Some, like Jeffrey Pickauer, had extracted billions before the collapse, leaving others in ruin. Entire charitable foundations, including those that had survived wars and financial crises, found themselves emptied, their missions abruptly halted. The human toll was staggering. Families were torn apart by the shame and desperation that followed. Some victims had invested generational wealth only to discover that the very lifeline they had passed down to their children and grandchildren had evaporated. Retirees who had meticulously saved for decades faced the grim reality of bankruptcy and dependency. Foundations that supported education, Holocaust survivors, and medical research were left scrambling, unable to fulfill promises to those who relied on their assistance. Every loss carried a story of trust betrayed, lives upended, and dreams extinguished. Within this chaos, investigators uncovered the roles of Bernie's closest associates, those who had helped him maintain the illusion of legitimacy. Frank DePascali, his right-hand man, had meticulously maintained false ledgers and created elaborate records to give the appearance of real trades. Annette Bongorno, who had been with Madoff for decades, processed fraudulent client statements, ensuring that every account looked consistent and believable. Jerome O'Hara and George Perez, the programmers, had engineered the digital backbone of the scheme, creating systems that generated convincing, yet entirely fictional, trade histories. Even those who weren't fully aware of the depth of the fraud contributed to its survival simply by following routine tasks without questioning the moral implications. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Bernie's capacity for psychological manipulation remained apparent. Victims who came face to face with him often described a surreal experience, a man who exuded charm, calm authority, and almost paternal reassurance, as if he were offering guidance rather than confessing to a crime that had destroyed lives. Some investors could barely reconcile the idea that the man who had once counseled them on investment strategy, delivered charity speeches, and cultivated appearances of generosity could simultaneously be the architect of one of the largest financial deceptions in history. The investigation also revealed the shocking scope of Bernie's deception. The Ponzi scheme had spanned decades, carefully crafted to appear consistent and reliable. Investors received statements showing regular gains, while in reality, no market activity had taken place. The illusion was so convincing that even sophisticated fund managers and analysts failed to spot the impossibility of his returns. Bernie had turned trust into a weapon, creating a system in which people themselves reinforced the deception by proudly recommending him to peers and colleagues. This self-reinforcing cycle amplified the reach and depth of the scheme, ensuring that even when suspicions arose, the sheer scale of his credibility kept them at bay. In the weeks following his arrest, victims struggled to navigate the labyrinthine process of recovering their lost funds. Lawsuits were filed, settlements negotiated, and forensic accountants pored over every remaining record. The Madoff Victim Fund was eventually established to compensate some of those who had been defrauded. But the reality remained stark. Billions were unrecoverable. Some investors were left with only fragments of their original wealth, forced to rebuild from scratch while carrying the psychological scars of betrayal. The names of the victims' people, like Elie Wiesel, who saw millions disappear from foundations supporting humanity, or families who had dedicated lifetimes to building legacies, became symbols of trust shattered, on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Yet even amid the destruction, stories of courage and resilience emerged. Certain investors, rather than succumbing to despair, confronted the financial institutions that had funneled money to Madoff's accounts, demanding accountability. Whistleblowers, journalists, and independent investigators tirelessly reconstructed the scheme's operations, piece by piece, ensuring that every fraudulent transaction, every forged ledger, and every deception was documented. Their work would eventually form the blueprint for understanding the full magnitude of Bernie's fraud and, in some cases, recover portions of stolen funds. These efforts were monumental, requiring years of painstaking analysis. But they underscored the stark contrast between the destruction Bernie left behind and the determination of those unwilling to surrender. Within the Madoff organization, the psychological pressure on his associates was equally profound. Individuals like Frank DePascal faced the moral and legal repercussions of their involvement. Some, initially loyal to Bernie out of trust or fear, eventually confessed, unraveling the inner workings of the Ponzi machine and exposing the meticulous nature of the deception. The court proceedings became a theater of revelation, where the mechanical coldness of the fraud collided with the human emotions of remorse, betrayal, and disbelief. Every testimony reinforced the terrifying truth. Bernie had orchestrated a system in which the line between reality and illusion had been so blurred that even the people working inside the company could not fully distinguish one from the other. The forensic investigation also illuminated the careful planning behind Bernie's operations. He had anticipated market fluctuations, investor inquiries, and even regulatory scrutiny, creating a contingency system that allowed the illusion to persist even under stress. Each account was treated like a living entity, with fake trades designed to mimic real market behavior. Every month, statements were generated to reflect gains that mirrored or slightly exceeded market averages, fostering a sense of security and normalcy. The meticulous design of the system was both genius and malevolent, a perfect storm of mathematical understanding, psychological manipulation, and unrelenting ambition. As the case progressed, it became painfully clear that Bernie's reach extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire institutions, charitable networks, and investment communities had been inadvertently complicit, not through intent, but through a dangerous combination of trust and blind reliance. The scandal forced a reckoning across the financial world, prompting regulators to question their oversight, investors to reconsider the nature of due diligence, and institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about complacency and vulnerability. And yet, despite all the evidence, despite the arrest, despite the testimonies, despite the billions lost, Bernie Madoff himself remained an enigma. He had surrendered, he had confessed, and he would face the consequences, but the man behind the facade, the architect of one of history's largest frauds, remained unsettlingly composed. His ability to manipulate perception, to command loyalty, and to orchestrate deception had not been destroyed by the collapse of the empire. In many ways, the psychological grip he held on both victims and associates persisted even as investigators tried to dismantle every last piece of the Ponzi puzzle. When Bernie Madoff was finally sentenced, the courtroom felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the final act of a tragedy decades in the making. The man who had once commanded billions with a flick of his hand now sat quietly, hands folded, staring at the floor, almost serene. 70 years old, his empire destroyed, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would die behind bars. For the thousands of victims, for the families who lost everything, for the foundations wiped out and charities devastated. It was a moment of justice, but justice alone could not erase the scale of devastation he had wrought. The aftermath was staggering. Investigators, forensic accountants, lawyers, and bankruptcy trustees scrambled to untangle the web of deceit Bernie had meticulously built. It wasn't just about money. It was about decades of carefully constructed lies, digital forgeries, and an illusion that had fooled the most sophisticated financial minds in the world. Each account needed to be traced, each statement verified, each loss documented. Some funds were partially recovered, but the vast majority of the stolen wealth had vanished into the void Bernie had created. Families who had once celebrated financial milestones now faced bankruptcy proceedings. Charities that had relied on his generosity had to shutter programs, cut aid, and rebuild from nothing. The human and emotional toll was as enormous as the financial one. Many of Bernie's close associates faced consequences as well. Frank DePascali, his longtime deputy, eventually confessed to orchestrating the daily mechanics of the Ponzi scheme, offering investigators and prosecutors a rare glimpse into the inner workings of the fraud. Annette Bongiorno, who processed client statements and maintained the illusion of legitimacy, pleaded guilty and cooperated, though the guilt weighed heavily. Others involved in the digital manipulation of records faced legal repercussions, their careers and reputations destroyed. Even so, some former employees continued to assert they had no idea of the magnitude of Bernie's deception, highlighting the sheer depth of the psychological manipulation he had perfected over decades. Across the nation, victims struggled to process the enormity of the loss. Some, like the families of retirees who had entrusted their life savings to Bernie, faced sudden ruin. Others, including charitable organizations, had to close operations and reevaluate missions that had taken generations to build. Some high-profile victims, such as foundations managed by Steven Spielberg and Elie Wiesel, managed to recover partial funds, but the process was painstakingly slow. For many, the trust that had been their lifeline, the trust in Bernie Madoff as a competent, ethical, and reliable steward of their wealth, was shattered forever. Yet amid the darkness, there were sparks of resilience and justice. Investigators, lawyers, and forensic teams worked tirelessly to recover and redistribute funds through the Madoff Victim Fund, a federal effort aimed at providing restitution to some of those most devastated by the fraud. Through a combination of legal settlements, asset seizures, and diligent financial reconstruction, billions were eventually returned to victims, though it was only a fraction of the total lost. Each recovered dollar represented painstaking detective work, months of legal maneuvering, and the tireless pursuit of accountability in a system designed to prevent, not undo, such large-scale deception. Even as legal proceedings concluded, the psychological shadow of the scandal lingered. Families wrestled with betrayal on both a personal and financial level. Trusted advisors were forced to confront their own complicity, and financial institutions reevaluated policies, oversight, and regulatory practices. The story of Bernie Madoff became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked trust, the seduction of consistently safe returns, and the vulnerability of human psychology to charm, authority, and prestige. Wall Street, regulators, and investors alike had been forced to face the uncomfortable reality that the most sophisticated system in the world could be undone by a single, calculating individual exploiting human trust. Bernie Madoff himself remained a figure of chilling calm, even as the empire he had built crumbled around him. He spent his final days in prison, largely isolated, a symbol of one of history's most meticulously orchestrated deceptions. Yet the human stories behind the numbers, the ruined families, The lost charities, the shattered lives continued long after his arrest. The Ponzi scheme, in all its scope and complexity, became a lens through which the world could examine greed, trust, ambition, and the dark side of charisma. Ultimately, the collapse of Madoff's empire was not just a financial story, it was a human story. A thriller that spanned decades, spanning Wall Street boardrooms, charitable foundations, and family homes. Every forged ledger, every manipulated statement, every betrayal revealed the terrifying power of a single mind, a single will, and a single lie sustained over time. And while justice had been served in court, the lessons of his fraud echoed in every corner of finance, philanthropy, and personal investing. Even today, the name Bernie Madoff conjures more than just numbers. It represents the thin line between trust and deception, the fragility of human confidence, and the astonishing consequences of a carefully orchestrated lie. The story of his Ponzi scheme is a dark thriller etched into the history of America. A story of ambition, betrayal, and devastation so complete that it will be studied and remembered for generations. It is a reminder that even in the most sophisticated systems, the human element, trust, desire, and greed can be weaponized, leaving a trail of devastation that no law, no recovery, and no apology can fully erase. And so, the empire of Bernie Madoff came to an end, not with a bang in a trading room, but in a courtroom and prison cell, leaving behind millions of lives irreversibly changed, billions of dollars vanished, and a story of ambition, deception, and betrayal that would haunt the world forever. And that's the story of Bernie Madoff, the man behind the biggest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. An empire built on trust, deception, and greed destroyed lives across the world and left a permanent mark on financial history. From retirees losing everything to charities collapsing and billions disappearing. This was a crime that shook the very foundations of trust itself. If this story shocked you, fascinated you, or left you wanting more real-life scams and criminal masterminds exposed, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to Scamsphere, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next thrilling case. Share this video with anyone who loves true crime, financial thrillers, and the shocking stories the world almost forgot. And don't forget to comment below where you, rewatching from want to know how far the Scamsphere network stretches across the globe.